Okay, this is being live streamed now. It's live on Facebook now. সঞ্জয় হোস্ট করে দাও আমাকে। Barbara, would you like to talk for 1 hour or so, or 45? Yeah.
I haven't timed it, but I think it might be nearer an hour than 45 minutes.
Okay, 1 hour. So, and then you said that you can accept questions, right? You can answer.
Yes, I can accept questions. Whether I can answer them is another matter.
But it would be for half an hour more or something, or is that okay? Is
Yes.
there any time constraint for you? I mean, from your end? No.
No.
Okay, then it's
Only
fine.
hunger.
Okay. I'm admitting all.
अच्छा वो मेरा कैमरा ऑफ कर दो। हाँ हाँ
Okay, we can start now. On behalf of Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata, on behalf of the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata, I welcome you all to today's event, very important event, the Foundation Day lecture of IDSK. As you most probably you know that IDSK was founded in 2002. So this is the 19th year of our existence, and we are really happy to have Professor Barbara Harris-White today with us, and we are really thankful to her that she has agreed to give the Foundation Day lecture this year, 2021. Professor Barbara Harris-White, many of you probably know that she has had a long association with India. As a matter of fact, it goes back to 50 years or so, because she started with the Green Revolution and agrarian transition and those kind of issues in the early 70s. And then she continued her interest in the agrarian question, agricultural markets in India, in different parts of India. And uh, her subsequent research actually ranged quite a bit from poverty, deprivation, disability to gender issues. So she has been working on these issues mostly on India for very long time. And she has been associated with many academics, many scholars in India, including Professor Amyo Kumar Bagchi, who is present here today. Professor Bagchi is our founder director, and currently he is emeritus professor of IDSK. And I would request Professor Bagchi to say a few words about Barbara. And thank you, Barbara, again for having agreed to present the Foundation Day lecture today. Thank you very much. So I now request Professor Bagchi to say a few words about Professor Barbara Harris White. Professor Bagchi. Professor Bagchi, please unmute yourself. Professor Bagchi. I'm sorry, I think something happened. Because here, Professor Bagchi. Yeah, sir. Yeah, now we can see you. Could you please say a few words about Barbara?
I have known Professor Barbara since I think around 1973, when she was a fellow in the Center for South Asian Studies in Cambridge and as a visiting professor in Jesus College, Cambridge. Since then, I have known her as an indomitable worker on rural markets, on rural labor, on Adivasis, tribals. There is practically no area of political economy that has not touched. She has worked primarily in South India, but also I think briefly also in West Bengal, as far as I remember. I had seen her at a seminar in the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Kolkata. I have also met her frequently recently in Patna and Hyderabad, and I have learned an enormous lot from her work on rural markets, rural credit markets, the situation of poor peasants and small businessmen and their situation in the structure. I have also known that she has an enormous empathy on all the deprived of the world, West Africa, and she has many on in India, and I greatly look forward to listen to on the occasion of our foundation day for giving me this privilege of welcoming Barbara to the IDSK.
Thank you, Professor Bagchi. And we are now about to start Professor Barbara Harris White's lecture. Today's lecture, the title, as you can see, it's the metabolic rift and its social implications for non-metropolitan India. Now, over to Professor Harris White. Please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Great.
Just,
you very
Barbara, just one more announcement. That is,
Sure.
if in case the participants want to ask questions, they can type in the chat box, and so Professor Harris White will respond to those questions at the end of our lecture. Thank you very much.
But I'm sorry, some people did not mute themselves. That's why we are hearing some noise. Please ask them to mute themselves.
Please, participants, please mute yourselves. Please mute your microphones. Okay, thank you very much. Professor Barbara.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Bagchi, for your kind introduction, and also Professor Chakraborty. And good afternoon to all the IDS Kolkata colleagues who I see have been working so hard during the pandemic on the development implications of the response to the pandemic. Congratulations on this work. It's a great pleasure to use this miracle of technology to join you in Kolkata from Oxford. I was very, very grateful for the chance to research economics and political aspects of West Bengal's rice markets over a period of 25 years, but I haven't returned to Kolkata since 2008 and the publication of this book on rural commercial capital. That's the summation of my engagement with West Bengal, but the importance of agricultural markets also links me to Bangladesh, which I haven't visited for even longer. And although I'm not going to talk about agricultural markets this afternoon, it's obvious from the farm protests that there's a very urgent need to revitalize that kind of research. This week, however, I've been thinking about the work of Gail Onvit, the scholar and activist who died this week, having spent half a century enriching our understanding of Dalits, of gender subordination, of agrarian change, of rural class and caste struggles, and of the inner worlds and the theories of good society, of the activists who dedicated their lives to these kinds of causes. One of Gail Onvit's last papers is in this book, Theorizing Cohesive Development, which is when I think I last met Professor Bagchi, who has a wonderful chapter in this book. In Gail Onvit's contribution to that book, she's considering and reflecting about the space for alternative development paradigms, and she includes nature and the environment. And I'd like my lecture today to be a tribute to her work and a reflection on the sort of themes that she raised. This is very much work in progress, and I hope you'll all bear with it in that form. Okay, now I don't seem to be able to proceed to, right. The concept of metabolism was developed from cell biology and defined as the process of material exchanges in which nature is appropriated for the satisfaction of our human needs. And those material relationships have a twofold regulation. In nature, natural laws govern physical processes, and that's what natural sciences are about. And in society, at the same time, institutionalized norms and behavior govern the division of labor and the distribution of wealth. And one of the themes that is implicit in this talk is that while knowledge is both an instrument of liberation and an instrument of domination, the epistemological rift that we have in knowledge about nature and about society, about the two forms of regulation, will need to be bridged in the 21st century. Otherwise, we're completely screwed. The metaphor of nature having a tap and or consisting of taps and sinks is very useful. Nature as a tap invites us to consider natural resources which we need to vitalize our economies. But nature as a sink is less considered and is the territory of decomposition and recomposition of materials. We think of development as the co-evolution of the natural laws, the physical laws, economic processes, and the social, institutional norms and political struggles that accompany those processes. And all of us in development studies know that there are many ways in which to study and also to critique development seen in this form. By and large, the depletion of nature conceived as a tap has been accepted because it's not yet, although it's coming, an immediate obstacle to the production of value. Yet it is nature as a sink and the toxicity of the sinks that is increasing and becoming a constraint on economic development. And nature as a sink is something we just do not study in development. Now, moving from the concept of metabolism to that of the metabolic rift, it has been given a number of attributes, a robbery system by the American agricultural economist George Carey, and Justus von Liebig referred to it as spoliation. It's an idea that originated in the mid-19th century debates about agriculture when Europe was experiencing a yield crisis. And through von Liebig's writing, it became understood that while labor and material resources, and there are vivid descriptions of the trade in guano from Peru and the digging up of bones from old European battlefields and a discussion of fertilizers and the need for what are now known as spatial fixes through trade and through movement. Labor, together with material resources, was seen as able to increase the physical productivity of soil. And at the same time, and this is why there were lively debates, material resources can also degrade the soil. So it can do both things, it can work in both directions. One example I read recently is that of chicken waste, high in nitrogen, but also high in salt, which leads to acidification of soil. Chicken waste is surprisingly high in heavy metals, which pollute the soil, and chicken waste can also carry plant diseases. So you can put chicken waste back on the field and you can raise yields, but you also introduce these negative elements into the soil. And Engels, who was much more interested in this at first than Karl Marx, in discussion with Marx, gave rise to this statement that it's capital, above all, that gives rise to an irreparable rift in the interdependent processes of social metabolism prescribed by laws of nature, which undermine both the soil and the worker. And they saw the soil and the worker as the original sources of all wealth. And now in political economy, actually to read the history of this concept, Kohei Saito's book is excellent. In contemporary political economy, the disconnect between material flows and social relations, which starts with agriculture's break in the nutrient cycle, is called the social, ecological, metabolic rift. And this talk is really to encourage everybody to put their shoulders to the wheel and to flesh out what that social, ecological, metabolic rift means for development. Now, in the rest of my talk, I want to tell two stories of two different sectors. One, agriculture, which provides resources, so in that sense is a tap, and the other, waste from towns, which is very definitely part of nature's sink. And because of the state of scholarship and my knowledge of scholarship, there will be two ways of telling these two stories under the aegis of development studies. And I hope people who are interested in theory and in method will take away not just the substance of what I want to say, but the way in which it's studied and presented. The stories are at two different scales. One is all India and one is very, very localized. And they use two different kinds of evidence, one official statistical evidence and the other is fieldwork and ethnography. And I've done this deliberately to show that there are many ways in which people with different positions in development studies and different disciplinary backgrounds can contribute to our understanding of the social, ecological, metabolic rift. So the first story is agriculture. Why, when the title of my talk is non-metropolitan India and urban India, do I begin with a case study from agriculture? Because agriculture is absolutely essential to the urban economic base in terms of food, in terms of agro-industrial raw materials, in terms of labor, and also, I haven't put it on the slide, but also through the terms of trade in terms of financial flows. Towns are the product of these social relations and flows. And it's also important to realize, especially in the debates about the farm laws and administered prices, that the rural-urban terms of trade, the relationship between agricultural prices and non-agricultural prices, are really vital to the price structure of the rest of the economy. And that so much of it is informalized and not controlled by the state is an advantage, because probably these basic prices are lower than they would be otherwise. And then, for those of you with a sociological background, the new field of agrarian urbanization is being developed on the hypothesis that rural institutional norms shape urban society. So there's a very interesting literature on caste in new towns and the way in which they relate to the land relations that those new towns have been built on top of. So I make no apology for my first case study being agricultural. Now, let's look at the way in which agriculture creates that metabolic rift first discussed in the 19th century. We all know that land-based production needs sun and it needs water, but it also needs, in the region of 17 basic mineral nutrients, I think 4 of them, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and hydrogen, they form almost in compounds. They form the vast bulk, like 95% of all dry matter in the soil. And nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium were recognized from the mid-19th century by von Liebig onwards. And we see that over the last 50 to 70 years, worldwide, agriculture has been completely transformed by chemical mineral fertilizers. 1950, there were 15 million metric tons used, now over 200 million metric tons. And China uses twice as much as America and India combined. And there's a similar growth in chemical pesticides and weedicides. And if we turn from the world to India, we see that food grains production, again, in 1950 was 51 million tons, with 70,000 metric tons of fertilizer. And it's now 306 million tons with 29 million tons of fertilizer. So that is both alerting us to a huge achievement, which has enabled India to feed its population, much intertwined with the Green Revolution, and also with energy and with the development of water resources. But if you look at the relationship between input and output, you will also see there's a problem. So that what we what we are looking at is actually a growing metabolic rift. We're looking at the export of nutrients, which is uncompensated from the marketed surplus, and the separation of nutrients, which is uncompensated from the uncoupling of livestock from crop production and from feed production. This is altering and wrecking and toxifying the material balances of the soil, while the nutrients that are exported are flowing, as it were, to the sea. And wherever they flow, they're unavailable matter and energy. And over that 70 years, worldwide and in India and in Europe, the spatial scope of that process has accelerated dramatically over time, extending local imbalances to being global ones. And subterranean energy from fossil fuels, massively implicated in the Haber-Bosch process of industrial fixing of nitrogen, is just a temporary emancipation from land, as Mayumi put it in 1991. And we're now reaching the end of that temporary emancipation. Now, what is the effect of the metabolic rift on agriculture itself? Massive effects, very depressing to read. I'll go through them quickly. We're in an era of yield plateaus, in a declining ratio in general in agricultural crops between in the yield response to inputs, fertilizer, what I described on 2 slides back, but also a declining energy input-output ratio as well. So we're watching agriculture in physical terms as being a linear dissipative process. This has involved the decline in soil organic matter and an increase in soil mineralization and contamination, with acidification, a buildup in reactive nitrogen, which interferes with photosynthesis and soil generating processes, and a loss of minor nutrients and trace elements in the soil. At the same time, there's a research field looking at greenhouse gases and agriculture, which are non-trivial. Even if they're produced by some of the poorest people in India, we cannot ignore the fact that greenhouse gases are being produced from agriculture. It's not a carbon fixing, it's a net carbon generating activity. And then pollution of water, biodiversity loss, including things we can't see. It's the collapse of microbial populations. And then chemical toxicity in the food chain from microbes, from adulteration, from additives and chemical contamination, which are threats to human health. And there is a very big literature in development on pesticide as a mode of death, of suicide. At the same time, the economists will tell us about increasing subsidies and an increasing foreign exchange burden, so that agriculture is socially, ecologically unsustainable. The rift also doesn't just have physical and biological flows. It's been theorized as also having a class nature in which pillage and plunder is dominated by capitalist farmers, whereas the small farmer will return most nutrients to the soil. I happen to think this is idealized and probably not the case, but this is the theory. The capitalist extracts them, and wage labor is certainly not paid to be a trustee of natural resources, but is paid as a cog in the manufacture of surplus. And competition for shares of the post-harvest distributive margin widen the rift and put pressure on this compulsion to extract resources and not to return them. And here are some images of the rift in practice. This is what the metabolic rift looks like, with drought parched soils, salinized soils, the reverse, flooded, inundated soils, polluted water. If you look hard in the bottom left slide, you'll see bubbles coming through the paddy field, and those bubbles are methane. And the close interrelation between cattle and manure and soil health is being disrupted, and we also have soil erosion. So these are some very vivid images of the metabolic rift as it looks like in action, in practice. How to repair? Can we conceive development and the study of development as having a purpose of repairing this kind of metabolic rift? Well, the answer is yes, we certainly can. We can reconceptualize the farm not as a set of chemicals in a production function, but as a biological organism, which requires restitution or restoration in the process of production. And as part of that, there are literatures on the value of crop-animal linkages, of biological nitrogen fixation, and a lot of research going on there, of the things that were practiced 200 years ago: rotations, intercropping, diversification, the value of recycling crop residues, and of developing scientific composting and water management. But these ideas are not new. Actually, Albert Howard is credited with having been the originator of organic agriculture as early as 1928, almost 100 years ago in India. The ideas have developed alongside the accelerated development of chemical fertilizer. In other words, they're powerful ideas, but chemical fertilizer is an even more powerful material process. And I date it to 2014, when FAO very suddenly decided to be pro-organic agriculture. Organic agriculture has many labels. Conservation agriculture, that's the term adopted by FAO, agroecology, in India, zero budget natural farming. There are many labels, dozens of labels. There has been quite a triumphalist literature about how fast it's expanding, but as yet it's only 1.5% of cultivated land worldwide. In India, it's expanded very rapidly from 42,000 hectares at the start of this century to about 19 lakh hectares now. But just remember, that's 1% of total cultivated land. And 12 lakh producers, 1.2 million producers using organic technology. But again, they are just over 1% of India's total. And yes, a wide great range of crops. I won't read them out, but you can see them in the slide across the board, from plantation crops through to basic grains. But my point, if we start looking at the metabolic rift, not just as a theoretical concept, but in its real effects on the land, is that the re-articulated rift is developing and changing in its constitution, but we can't get rid of it. It remains. So it's claimed that organic agriculture outperforms chemical agriculture in yield. This isn't really true when we look at what's called naturally organic agriculture in rain-fed regions of India, which are the most deprived environmentally. And in any case, there is very solid evidence to show that at first there is a yield gap, and the easing of the yield gap takes place slowly over time, which has huge implications for public policy. And to recycle and to regenerate organic soil nutrients is not really conceived by agroecologists as a major investment, but that's how I think it should be conceived, because it can't be done without the lagged development of all kinds of new industries which would feed into this process. What do I mean? I mean biofertilizer, bioorganic products, developing animal waste as an industry, as a trade, recycling byproducts, changing land use to grow legumes and leaf manure, sorting out how to manage plant protection from pests and weeds, with organic resources, managing underground water and the bioecological limits that exist everywhere to chemical-based innovation, conserving the diversity of species within the trophic structure of the biosphere. Now, for all this, not only do I think we need a lot of investment, which has never really percolated through into the literature on organic agriculture, we also have to develop what Gail Onvet was talking about in that late paper of hers, a new form of social knowledge. Marx called it the knowledge of the associated producers. It's a knowledge of trusteeship, a new mixing of science with theories of actually existing social development. And I do not think that development studies has this knowledge. And I also think that development studies is a prime territory for that knowledge to evolve. I won't dwell over this, but this is the these are the elements of organic agriculture, with animal waste being recycled in various forms with various degrees of processing, more on the right than in the top left, and with organic rice and poorly milled rice, which conserves a lot of oil and protein in the rice in the bottom right. Okay, so there are a number of other problems. If we are trying to think practically about how organic agriculture would develop to repair the rift and also feed the non-agrarian population in India, biodegradable consumption waste and human sewage is certainly not certified, and it's not recycled in India. In fact, there are very few parts of the world where it is recycled. Food waste tends to disappear down the back streets to micro dairies and urban livestock. It doesn't get recycled to the land. And the current supplies of green manure are inadequate even for small acreages. And there may be, as I explained with the chicken waste example, mismatches between manures and particular kinds of soil. Much more needs to be known and made publicly aware about that part of the repair cycle for the metabolic rift. In India, the crop and livestock economy lacks the means to re-articulate. It's one of the big criticisms of zero budget natural farming. And if you could re-articulate it and grow and produce as much livestock as would fertilize land, you would need a lot more pasture, which has indirect land use change implications, which again are not really considered by the agroecologists. Greenhouse gas emissions also rocket under anaerobic decomposition of cow dung. It's not the unmitigated benefit that its advocates suggest. And against carbon sequestration by plants, we have the enormous involvement of coal in the electricity which is used to raise irrigation water, so that something like 70% of greenhouse gases in production distribution systems are actually from coal in agriculture. It's a bit counterintuitive, but if you do life cycle analysis, that's the outcome. Systematic greenhouse gas emissions post-harvest are unaddressed. It's not a critique, it's just a field that can be the subject of research and development. And the early ideas of trusteeship and of socio-ecological restitution are really trounced by the paramountcy of profit and of livelihoods and returns to production. Now, returns to production ought to be better because of lower costs of production. But organic agriculture has an additional cost, which is sometimes very costly and is a disincentive to innovate, which is the cost of certification for premium output prices. And it's not at all clear yet whether organic agriculture feeds a segmented market, a niche market, or whether there's competition between niche marketing institutions, which form local monopolies, and supermarkets, which form national oligopolies. So the implication of this change in technology for the marketing system is very obscure as yet. And then there's a kind of policy rift between the agroecologists' neglect of the structure of demand, the fact that non-producing rural labor and the entire urban non-agrarian economy has food as its basic condition of existence. And so supplying the cities is a very great concern of food policy planners. And yet food security policy planners have to factor in the enormous public expenditure implications of the buffer stock that will be necessary to be in state hands, nowhere else, for the considerable period of transition. We're talking about 5 to 10 years. And this is a very big question everywhere in the world. It's a question whose answer is obvious, and yet it's completely flatly against neoliberal ideology of market supremacy. So this part of my talk results in a reluctant conclusion that the metabolic rift in agriculture might be partially compensated for, but it cannot be transcended. It will always exist for the reasons I've just laid out. I want now to turn, and for the rest of the talk, to the rift between town and country. And town and country here can be considered as representing a similar kind of argument about the rift between industry and agriculture, industrialized agriculture and organic agriculture, or the rift between food production and the consumption basket of those food producers. All of these relations are characterized by a socio-ecological rift. Let us turn to the arguments about town and country. Again, they result from the debates in the mid-19th century, but they're as relevant now as they were then. And the argument is that towns or industry concentrates the drivers of social progress. Political progress is concentrated in towns and cities. But towns, like agriculture, also break the nutrient cycle. And a key aspect of global capitalist accumulation, especially over the last 70 years, has been the expanding spatial dislocation of those metabolic flows between town and countryside, and the gaps that are generated by the flows from rural to urban consumption locations. And Marx and Engels wrote, capitalist production, by collecting the population in great centers and causing an ever-increasing preponderance of town population, on the one hand, concentrates the historical motive power of society. That's the social progress. On the other hand, it disturbs the circulation of matter between man and soil. In other words, it prevents the return to the soil of the elements that are consumed by man in the form then, in the 19th century, of food and clothing, but now in a vastly varied set of forms. And they wrote, it therefore violates the conditions necessary to the lasting fertility of the soil. So we go back to the metabolic rift in agriculture. But the rift worldwide is now due unambiguously to the logic of capital. It's no longer part of the despoliation of some communist experiments where nature was taken for granted. It is now capital that bestrides the world like a colossus. And in the expanded reproduction process of capital, inanimate energy replaces labor, and the rift deepens and widens potentially to a planetary reach in which we're all implicated in one another's consumption, and it also changes its composition. Now, I may be wrong, but I think that little is known in India about the social inequalities created by the metabolic rift outside big cities and in India's enormous informal economy, which is unregistered. And in the rest of my talk, I want briefly to explore the social and economic dynamics of just one aspect of this rural-urban metabolic rift. And this is going to differ from the structure of the argument about agriculture by virtue of it being a case study, which I have experienced through fieldwork in South India since 2015. And so the second story is about the metabolic rift and waste. What is waste? Waste is substance which has no value and is useless to capital. This stage may be very short and fleeting and hard to catch hold of. And the case of vegetable waste in the town I studied is an example of a very rapid recycling of waste as it re-enters production as a raw material. Alternatively, it may be geologically long, unrecycled plastic, for instance, and some waste metals are sitting very, very slowly recomposing themselves over hundreds of thousands of years. And the general acceptance of the factors, the definition of waste as having no value, is maybe ignoring the fact that this kind of waste has negative value through its toxic effects on nature. Now, despite the theories of circular economy, society as a whole, expressed through the economy, can't avoid producing gaseous, liquid, and solid waste, even produced in the handling of waste. It's completely unavoidable everywhere. So taking India and small town India as a case study is not a judgment. It's simply an exploration of something which is going on throughout the world. In India, it's one of the fastest growing unstable sectors of the economy, although you won't find it in national account statistics. Nobody really knows how much is produced every day, but it's in the region of 260,000 tons. A third is from agriculture, a third is from industry, which is an equal proportion of GDP, and a third from households. Hoornweg and his colleagues in a paper in Nature in 2013 predicted that India's waste will grow for about a century until peak waste, when efficiencies in packaging and in production will start to overwhelm the increase in waste due to the growth of the economy. I think this is quite speculative, but the idea of India's waste growing for another century focuses the mind wonderfully. Generally, it's treated as an externality, which was the title of my talk. And at best, there's a mantra which school children are taught: reuse, recycle, reduce, reprocess. But not much attention is paid to waste, and the photographs that I'm going to show you are very good, are very suggestive of the reasons why waste is the poor relation of academic research. Right at the outset, one of its characteristics, I use the word crudity, one of its essential characteristics is its incoherence. It is classified and it's socially constructed in many incoherent ways. So the field of waste as an academic field is just as chaotic as waste on the ground. And here is the reason I got interested in it, studying other things around a decade ago, being hit in the face by waste everywhere I looked in small towns I was studying. So as a chaotic field for academic research, you tend to get particular kinds of waste being studied: plastic waste, Carvely Gill, e-waste, waste from leather industries. So specific sectors of waste are studied, or a specific quarter or a street in a metropolitan city is studied, and then inferences are made. And in studying the town, I decided to develop another heuristic. So I looked at the way waste is produced in the circuits of capital inside the town. So I'm going to talk about the production of waste in production, that is in the production of commodities. The production of waste in distribution, I'm looking at physical distribution and economic distribution. The production of waste in consumption, which is the waste that we see all the time and the waste that invited me to study it. The production of waste in the production of labor, that is human waste, and there is a big subfield on manual scavenging, but I want to mainstream that as part of the circuits of capital, and the production of waste in the reproduction of society, and I look at medical waste. And so I am not a physicist or a biologist, and I know that the next way forward in the new science that I feel needs to be developed is to conceive these circuits of capital and the waste they produce in physical and biophysical terms. I haven't done that. I've looked at the social relations of waste. And so this is all partial. But as you can see running down the bottom of this slide, there is an extreme of wealth and poverty embodied in the circuits of capital through which waste is circulated and distributed and disposed of in this small town. And we can ask the question, are there classes at work in waste? And the answer is yes, it's a field of accumulation. And at the bottom of this slide, I've put that I think that it's a field of accumulation like any other part of India's economy. So you have public sector activity, state-regulated distribution, where engineers and supervisors and sanitation workforce operate. You have regular capitalist accumulations through private corporations and big family businesses, accumulating and extracting surplus through a variety of means. You also, as so often in India, have a vast, less visible army of petty producers and waste traders who are often regarded as disguised wage labor, but insofar as they are acting autonomously, have to be considered as petty production in its own right. And then you have classes of labor defined according to the degree of precarity inside and outside work and poverty, but not necessarily in an internal contradiction in the same way as capital and labor have been theorized to contradict themselves. So I won't spend much time on this slide. What it shows is that there is an occupational hierarchy in waste, just as there is in other sectors of the economy. On the left, we're looking at different statuses of wage labor, from high income at the top to low income, through wage labor with contracts in the formal economy and with an asset base, which they can also use for other activity, through regular wage labor in the informal sector, casual wage labor, out workers and home workers, utterly unprotected wage labor, and bonded labor right at the bottom. And on the right, under self-employment, you have a great range of categories of actors, if you like, don't like that word, from asseted self-employed people or with family labor or with employees, right down to unpaid family labor and self-employed, precarious and even destitute workers. So there's a whole complicated occupational hierarchy in waste. And so one at the same time, I'm going to argue that it's a field of accumulation like anything else, but I think the work conditions are highly oppressive, but I'm not altogether sure that they are so oppressive that they're different from other sectors of the economy. But I want to stress the physical danger of waste work, encountering sharp metals, and municipal workers know the Human Rights Watch statistic, which is that 90% of them die before the age of retirement. It's exceedingly offensive work. The stink is something which never goes away, and people don't get used to it. You can't you can't factor it out. And maggots and body parts, all kinds of stories I was told of the horrible things that are found by people who collect waste. It's also a violent sector. There's brawls. Alcohol plays a major part in numbing people's experience of the waste environment, and assault and brawls are part of that violent work environment. And then there's infectious waste from clinics and hospitals, which doesn't get disposed of in separate supply chains and can cause infection. And then the work is very heavy, as you can see on the right, and hard. The shifts are exceedingly long. The work is often 12-hour day. Then there's bondage and extortion. Even for municipal sanitation workers, people employed by the government, the contracts are increasingly ad hoc and incomplete, and the rights, the work rights, are not respected. And in the informal waste economy, some of the returns are very, very low. So this is the mood music behind the rest of my talk. This is the environment and the conditions for work. Okay, I'm sorry this is handwritten, but I didn't have time to type it. The institutional pathways, the actually existing physical pathways through which the flows and stocks of the metabolic rift mediated by waste in a small town are very varied. And that's what I'd like you to take away from this. In industrial production, in this town, there was a liquor factory and there were a load of rice mills. You have more interaction with the land around the town than in any other sector of the economy, I think. The liquid waste from the liquor factory is piped to the riverbed and pollutes not just the riverbed, but also the surrounding land. The waste from rice mills becomes a raw material. Bran goes for bran oil extraction, and the byproduct from bran, the waste from bran, is even exported to the EU as cattle feed. Husk is used for firing, and it is the ash from husk which is taken and spread on fields. It's a free good, and when it piles up too much in a rice mill might even pay a farmer to take it away. But that is the one kind of recycling that is very obvious in this town, from factories back to the land, in the way that Marx and Engels said would repair the metabolic rift. In distribution, the waste, I looked at Indian railways as the distribution of people, and the vegetable market, distribution of commodities. The vegetable market produces enormous quantities of food waste and vegetable waste, and this is rapidly taken away before it rots as raw material for an urban livestock industry in the back streets. And that in turn produces animal waste, which is mixed with general consumption waste. And Indian Railways produces a lot of waste, but is also handled as consumption waste. So turning to consumption waste, the metabolic pathways of consumption waste, the people, officials in charge of it in the municipality don't know how much is produced in the town, and the estimates varied quite a lot, but roughly half becomes raw material for reprocessing through an informal industry of segregation and bulking into 200 different types of raw material, which are exported from a scrapyard for reprocessing in other towns. And the other half goes to the dump yard, where it's exceedingly dangerous to labor, and it's also toxic to nature. Human waste, waste created in the production of labor, ought to be treated, but in this town it's not treated at all. Many routes, but mainly it's mixed with general consumption waste, and it goes to the dump yard, where it adds to the health hazard of the dump yard, or it's cycled through septic tankers and septic tanks, where it's simply dumped in a water body where it has completely toxified the water environment, and there is no life in this very large water body. And lastly, reproductive waste, medical waste, infectious waste should be incinerated and treated separately, but that is on hold because incineration causes air and ground pollution. So it should be buried, but more and more is found mixed with consumption waste. Okay, so those are the pathways, or complicated pathways through which the waste of the town is disposed of outside the town boundary. Okay, so now I want briefly to flesh out the capital labor relations, the social relations of these metabolic pathways. Firstly, the production of waste in production. If you look at the top, you'll see a deki, which comes from West Bengal and reminds me that in my own working lifetime, rice processing has gone from foot-operated deki to these integrated modern rice mills, which you see in the main part of the slide. And in the front of this photograph, you'll see great piles of husk ash, which the owner can't do anything with and is burning. Okay, how is waste from productive activity handled as a social field? I've described most of the pathways earlier in the handwritten slide. So it is the raw material for various fields of accumulation, for capital and for labor. Waste tends to be a sector, an activity in which inequality inside the labor force is very obvious. The labor force dealing with waste in factory production is always casual labor, and it's mostly Dalit labor. And it's Dalitized, often as an expression of contempt. This is what the labor involved in waste handling inside factories feels. That they are stuck there in the lowest status activity as an expression of social contempt. Turning to waste and distribution, this is the kind of waste, foul waste and consumption waste, labor waste and consumption waste, which Indian Railways has to deal with. This found me doing field work on the railway tracks, which I had to keep very quiet about. The story here is that Indian Railways has caused an absolutely catastrophic decline in the terms and conditions of work and a 1/2 to 2/3 drop in earnings by privatizing this labor force, subcontracting it out to a private company. And the ladies in the middle are having to supplement their formal shift, which they do on formal contracts to a corporate organization, by informal work afterwards, hours and hours of it, in order to partially compensate for the drop in earnings that they have. And the other case study is the vegetable market. And this photograph is simply to highlight the role of animal agency in the recycling of waste inside the town. Vegetable waste feeds a colossal industry in the back streets of the town that is almost completely invisible, of cows, of cattle, milk cattle, small livestock, and thousands of pigs. Vegetables are themselves a field of a major field of accumulation in the economy of the town through registered wholesalers and long distance commodity contracts. And there's also, for every one wholesale dealer, there must be about 50 unregistered retail dealers paying daily rent to a registered auctioneer, but otherwise operating in the informal economy. And the labor force is unregistered, completely unregistered, and works alongside animals which graze on the food directly. And labor also picks that waste and supplies it to backstreet milk, meat producers and traders in animal byproducts. So there's an economy which is very poorly studied, which is actually very important to the poor people of the town, supplied by the free good of vegetable waste. Indian Railways, I already described that there are registered contracts between Indian Railways, the public company, and private companies. And this contractualization of waste clearing by Indian Railways has been going on since about 2003. And as the labour force changes from being directly paid by the public corporation to being paid by a private corporation or a big family business, there's a catastrophic fall in earnings and also in work rights. And it is necessary for these workers to supplement their wages by informal self-employment activity, informal shifts. Consumption waste. I'm going to show you several slides to show you the various aspects of the system. It's a combination of a labour force paid by government, by the municipality, and a labour force paid by private subcontractors, and then a very large invisible labour force of self-employed gatherers. And this is the territory. The tools are very primitive, as you can see, and they remain very primitive. And the territory that they scour is like the photos in the bottom left and the right-hand photo. In the right-hand photo, please note that you have pipes coming out of houses taking human waste out of the top of septic tanks into these open drains and gullies in the town. Right from the outset, teams of workers are gathering specific kinds of material. They specialize material. In this photograph, there is aluminium and metals in the top left, cement bags in the top right, cardboard bottom right, and plastics bottom left. Now, these are being collected as the consumption waste labour force collects general waste. And this feeds an informal, poorly registered, hardly registered, or not registered hierarchy of segregators, bulkers, moneylenders, which reaches its apex in a colossal scrapyard of about 10 acres, in which there are hundreds of people, men are migrants and women are local, separating out the waste of this town into 200 raw materials for reprocessing. Meanwhile, the unrecycled waste is the product, it is the responsibility of the public sector on the left and the private sector on the right. And what this slide shows is that the public sector has primitive equipment, tractor trailers, and the living conditions of the workforce are not that bad. They're modest, but not bad. Whereas the private sector has more modern equipment. But if you look in the top right slide, they are living not in the nice white house in the back, but in these slummy tents. They are bonded migrant labor, living a subsistence life in absolutely terrible living conditions on the edge of town. 50% of the town's waste ends up in the dump yard. The top right photo is a dump yard of a village, alerting us to the fact that when we're talking about non-biodegradable waste, we're not only now talking about urban India, we're talking about rural India too. And this is a former quarry now being filled and grazed on outside a village. But the urban dump yard is in the rest of the photos, alerting you to the fact there's a labour force which is working on the surface of the burning surface of the dump yard, even after 3 or 4 screenings and scourings by other aspects of the formal and informal labour force of the town. Here is the dump yard after a flood in 2016. It's overflowing the walls. Here is the dump yard later on after a factory has been built on part of it, and it's now flowing out of the gates of the dump yard. It is completely out of control. Okay, what to say about social relations of consumption waste? I could say a lot. The main take-home messages are that the state sets the existence conditions for the informal economy through starvation of revenue because of tax avoiding, fiscal non-compliance, through neoliberal ideology and new public management, and through the contempt and neglect of the supervising labor force for this process. The municipal budget is capped at 49% on solid waste management. That's the euphemism. So they can't spend more than 49%. And the only way they can clean the town is to allow the informal labor force to do this for free and to subcontract for a lower sum than their public expenditure, which must include profit. And the only way you can do that is by cutting down on the wage bill. Meanwhile, the municipality is also under pressure to cut the wage bill. So you get deliberate casualization and cosmopolitanization. The jobs are no longer heritable. And basically, it's impossible to fulfill the duties without illegal activity. And so one gets subcontracting. I subcontract my job to some poor sod working in the informal economy. And the proliferation of informal activity and side jobs, which are hardwired into formal livelihoods. So there's an enormous economy of self-employed people who are all the way from people who are accumulating to working in waste as a last resort for people who are destitute and socially expelled. Okay, now for human waste, the main thing is this notice board on the top left, which invites people to install drain pipes and septic tanks into open drains, which then means that human waste is mixed with general consumption waste in the open drains of the town. And although human waste is supposed to be very strictly state regulated, in this town it is completely untreated and it's unregulated. And cleaning the consumption waste that you might be able to recycle when it's mixed with sanitary towels, incontinence pads, all kinds of shit, adds enormously to the working day and reduces the amount of substance that could be recycled from this town, usefully recycled in an activity which goes towards repairing the metabolic rift. And the labour force, we know from the literature on manual scavenging that it's been a territory for women, but manual scavenging was abolished in, I think, 1993. And this and the mixture of human waste with general consumption waste in gullies and alleys and drains means that it's now male work rather than female work. So there's been a change in the gendering of that horrible work. And the labour that does that work is working in more and more impossible conditions. By the way, in this town, there's nowhere for that workforce to relieve themselves or to change their clothing. Nowhere. They have to do that on the verges that they clean. And human waste is also the responsibility of the worst forms of bonded labour in the contracted private firm. So it is really a dire situation, which I didn't expect to discover. Lastly, the production of waste in socially reproductive activity and the case of medical waste. Now, these photos are not mine, they're Sarah Hodges' photos from Warwick University, who studied medical waste. In theory, hospital waste, clinic waste is segregated at source, and infectious waste goes in a separate, carefully regulated distribution system to an incinerator, top right, where it's burnt. But in practice, other things happen. In my area, the incinerator is not working because when it does work, the villagers in the villages around the incinerator are covered in white dust, about which they have complained vociferously. It is a form of NIMBY politics that we can all understand. and if at all, the infectious waste is being buried. But here you see pictures of people taking the waste in the top left off a waste lorry onto a hand cart and for processing in the informal economy by people who are either self-employed or they are the permanent casual workforce of a company which is cleaning, sorting, segregating, and bulking medical waste. And then they're formed into pellets and used for reprocessing. Okay, the health industry is, in this town that I studied, is like an industrial district. It's private, although it's heavily subsidized by the state in terms of the training of its people and the state providing the last resort safety net for private clinics. And the state officially regulates health, medical waste strategically through a number of departments. And maybe that's the problem, as I'll say in my final section, as I'll explain. And some records are kept for formal scrutiny, but leakages do occur, especially in the registered private sector. And I myself have walked on syringes on the dump. So I know from personal experience where infectious medical waste may end up. On labour, there is a flexible labour force inside these clinics where people are on verbal contracts for decades, and the work they do depends on patronage and discretion. So a lady I spoke to has worked as a theatre nurse and also in waste work as an illiterate, and also been in charge of drugs management. Most of his labels are in English, although she is illiterate. I mean, the mind boggles. So those are the class relations of the physical pathways of waste in this town. To conclude about the state's regulative role, the political boundary between the state being able to regulate and not able to regulate has very little to do with regulative law. It has more to do with the need of long distance contacts for some kind of record, because it's out of immediate personal control. Anyway, the very few formal contracts enable accumulation from waste, and fortunes are being made from it. And when we turn to labour, the political boundary between formal labour, which is declining, and informal labour, which is increasing, we have is constantly changing in the direction of rampant informalization, incomplete formal contracts, less and less claim to rights at work, more and more dependence on discretion, more casualization and contractualization. And what this does is create and perpetuate poverty. And the informal, unregistered economy of waste is not residual or temporary. It's not partially preemptive of regulation. It's not just useful to formal capital, and it's not new in penetrating the formal economy. And it's not a negotiated political compromise. It has long, long been indispensable to the formal waste economy, and the formal waste economy is indispensable to the productive economy, which it's also threatening. So the last part of my talk, if there's time, is to turn to what on earth is to be done. Because repairs to the metabolic rift through recycling are overwhelmed by the increase in waste and the change in the composition of waste that is taking place so rapidly, and by completely unacknowledged implications of the informal waste economy. I will go through this as fast as possible. There is no movement, as there is in organic agriculture, no mimicking of ecological interactions. The insights of Liebig, which have been around for 170 years, are not transferred, or they are ignored. In a paper I read yesterday, Subramaniam from MIDS said, policymaking to be effective requires assessments of magnitudes and trends of major events based on evidence. And although I can agree, I ask what evidence? Because in government, which is the last thing I want to turn to, waste is invisibilized. There's a doctoral thesis from IIM Ahmedabad coming on stream now, which explores this extensively, the invisibilization of waste. And here, I'm not going to use statistical evidence, I'm going to use ethnographic evidence of the constitutive context for policy. So policy to be effective needs evidence. What kind? The evidence that I amassed for the policy context focuses on poor quality law and loopholes in law, which reveals the lack of seriousness of the intention of policymakers. The bureaucratic architecture of local government is fractured. Waste appears in all 4 departments of local government, but it's right at the bottom of the responsibilities, whatever is said on paper. And the status of the urban area matters. A low status town, which is not a district headquarters, will have a different architecture from a district headquarters or a metropolitan city. Waste is also cut into network kinds of jurisdictions. Think drains, think canals, think channels of various kinds, just as electricity is. That on the one hand, and territorial kinds of jurisdictions on the other. And the two don't match at all, nor do territories always match, but that's another problem. But the spatiality of the jurisdiction of local government is cut into different kinds of concepts, let alone informalized practice of government, staffing, people turning up at 4 in the afternoon, party politics in the center of the state, determining administrative politics in a town run by a different party, lack of coordination at the town level and also at the district level, theft sharing, rent seeking and bribery, and a bureaucratic structure where private status, especially your gender and your caste, gives you more power than your official bureaucratic position. So it's not surprising that the local state is acting both for and against the informal waste economy. It allows it to happen. It knows that without it happening, it wouldn't be cleaned insofar as it is. And yet at the same time, it's a great nutrient base for extortion and harassment. So there is no policy for waste in this policy entity of the municipality. If you ask the officials who are responsible for it, the invisibility of waste becomes clear, and they parrot out best practice, which I came to realize they'd seen from television. Vermicomposting, although that's just the least of the problems of the town, and projectized response with responses which have no financial support. Excuse the 3 Ps there. And if you ask them what the waste problems are that policy should address, they don't know. And there's a huge lack of consensus amongst officials. They would point to antisocial behavior by citizens, especially the fact that citizens don't segregate, but citizens have no space to segregate. And even if they did, the waste labor force would not know how to deal with segregated waste because they don't have the equipment to deal with segregated waste. They would point to a lack of labor, but what they mean is lack of people like themselves, skilled engineers. And they would also point to lack of finance. If you ask the same question to the municipal sanitation workers, these are the formal labor aristocracy, they point to the need for revenue reform. They point to tax evasion as the major problem constraining the budget, which will enable them to do their work. So public education, and a reform of workforce numbers, which are atrophying, and skills, which they cannot acquire. Mechanization, selective mechanization, contact and consultation with officials who never talk to them, and an end to their contemptuous treatment. So the workers' problems for policy are the toxicity and the danger of waste to the public, the threats of waste to health and well-being. They're very different from the officials' understanding. And the two conceptions of policy problems, I think, are mutually exclusive, except perhaps lack of finance, which the workers attribute to tax evasion. I've almost finished, but I'd just like to make one or two further observations. At an all India level, zooming out from the small town, the solid waste management agenda is dominated by technological gigantism, and it completely neglects labor. In the cost benefit analyses that I've looked at, the labor costs are all those of very skilled engineers, and the, as it were, unskilled, we know they have many skills, labor force gathering waste is completely neglected as though it didn't exist at all. And if you start wandering the back streets of an Indian town, you will realize that the prime need is for descaling, for the opposite of gigantism, for small scale technology, and for the possibilities of retrofitting waste disposal technologies into very congested back streets of towns. Then the All India Solid Waste Management agenda completely ignores caste, as do most technical studies of waste. And ever since Valerian Rodriguez's chapter, his wonderful essay in Gopal Guru's book on humiliation, ever since that was published, it's been impossible to ignore the ubiquity of waste and its invisibility as a manifestation of the upper caste right to throw it. So it's a caste problem. It's not just the fact that waste disposal is the territory of low caste or outcast or scheduled caste labor force. It's actually a problem of the upper caste because they are the people who create the waste. And the technological and the social approaches to waste generate quite separate policy fields which are implemented separately and never mix. And the policy labels and the policy fields can actually perpetuate the problem that is intended to be resolved. And Beswada Wilson has, in many op-eds and reports, shown how Swachh Bharat preserves the stigma of low caste waste workers, neglects their rehabilitation and their moral appeal by low caste workers for status, for the work that they do, which is essential for the urban economy. And Swachh Bharat leaves upper caste profligacy and blindness and the benefits from low caste people's work totally unchanged and externalized. Okay, this is really my last slide. What is being done for the politics of waste? What are the politics of the waste workforce? And in this town, there are a lot of institutions which could cover waste workers, and the little list of trades unions, political parties, legal activism, civil society, caste association, kinships, and clans. That list suggests a lot of potentials, but actually, take-home message is that the many problems that waste workers faced as waste workers are only represented through their ungendered identities as Dalits and as Adivasis. So as Dalits and Adivasis, their identity enters local politics, but as waste workers, not at all. So the production of waste is unavoidable, and despite 150 years of the sciences of metabolism, the biophysical contributions of urban waste to the metabolic rift currently resemble those of the mid-19th century. And meanwhile, the town's business association president said, I love the Irulas, these are Adivasis, for 100 rupees a day they clean our town. And underlying everything, they are the people on whom the resolution of the metabolic rift currently rests. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Barbara Harris-White. And you requested 2 minutes break before I bombard the questions to you. Is it correct? You wanted a break, little bit, 1 or 2 minutes?
I would just like a minute to, because it's my lunchtime and I need, because of diabetes, I have to eat. So
Okay, please go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead. So we can wait for a couple of minutes, and then
okay.
we have a few questions in the chat box. So after we finish, then maybe we can start the question. Yeah, please,
Okay.
please go ahead.
Okay, count to 100.
হ্যালো, আচ্ছা এই অমৃতা বাসু এরকম ও হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে।
Okay, can we start now?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, the first question from Gareth Paul. The question is, what advice would you give to early career researcher interested in sustainable agriculture? I guess the question is in terms of research agenda, what do you suggest? Second question is, how do you think development studies can evolve to ensure the necessary transdisciplinary research is undertaken to plug these gaps? You have raised issues with the gaps remaining in development studies, so how do we plug the gap? Would you take the questions together or maybe one after another?
That's up to you.
Okay. Another question is that if organic produce is the alternative to pesticide, then to lessen the metabolic drift, could you suggest more mechanization in the industrial sector to reduce the waste production, rather than hiring informal Dalits and gig laborers, which deepen the gaps in wage labor? Maybe you can go ahead and then I'll ask you the other questions.
Quite big questions.
Okay.
To the question about sustainable agriculture as an early career researcher, I think there are many opportunities because of the role FAO has played in both pushing organic agriculture and the circular economy. And the EU has also backed the idea of the circular economy, which I personally think is physically impossible and energetically impossible. So I think that it's a field in which there are going to be growing opportunities. And I know most of the jobs in geography right now are asking for expertise in sustainable development. So I think the field is growing. At the same time, there are bandwagon effects, and where I think more research needs to be done is in conceiving organic agriculture as a system, as part of the food system, and looking at all the multipliers and the institutions that need to be in place for it to be more possible than it obviously is now. See, right now in India, about 1% of producers and 1% of cultivated land is down to organic agriculture. That has to change. And yet cities have to be supplied. So it seems to me that there are many, many problems, not just in agriculture, but in policy and in the upstream and downstream linkages of agriculture that are worthy of research in a way that isn't being researched right now. So I would say, I would want to be encouraging and positive about this, even though the message from my talk, from what I've read so far, is that the idea that we can actually heal the metabolic rift is a non-starter. All we can do is reduce it and make it less toxic. Development studies and transdisciplinary research. I think this is very difficult because if something isn't there, there needs to be the conditions under which it's seen as needed. I'm reminded of what's happening to Marxist scholarship in Britain. A generation is not being replaced, and students who are interested are forming reading groups and are learning in different ways. And I imagine that the transdisciplinary work will come out of those kinds of learning activities. There are, of course, funding agencies which pay lip service to interdisciplinarity, but the interdisciplinary projects that I have been watching are mostly multidisciplinary. They're disciplines proceeding along parallel lines beside one another. And occasionally they meet and talk, but they don't conceive the research together. And very often when you try to do that, science hegemonizes. If you want to calculate the greenhouse gases from agriculture, it will be very interesting to know whether there's a class difference in agriculture in the environmental impact. You have to bolt some kind of stylized agriculture producer onto a life cycle analytical framework, because that's the only way currently you can calculate greenhouse gases. So I think development studies has been going since the 70s as an academic discipline, and it had aspirations to be transdisciplinary. But I think as time has gone on, it has become more and more difficult, especially to get economics to speak to treasure house interpretive disciplines like anthropology or history. Economics, which is dominated by neoclassical theory. So I think it's more and more difficult to do what development studies was set up to do in the beginning. And I think we have to have unorthodox ways of experimenting with transdisciplinarity. If I could just spend 30 seconds, when we started our project in 2011 on greenhouse gases in agriculture, there were 11 disciplinary subfields that we needed to master: informality, rice, climate change, labor studies, socio-technical studies, policy studies, and on and on. And all the members of the team had different disciplinary backgrounds, what to do. So what we did was to invent a learning workshop where people presented cutting-edge papers as though they were their own, but they were outside their discipline. And hello, somebody else is screen sharing.
Right.
They were outside their discipline and they were not written by the presenter. And these papers were then discussed by somebody who was outside the discipline. And there were no brownie points. There was no particular goal for this. We all brought our baggage. We presented, we discussed, and we went away after 2 days, having learned whatever it was we learned. But at least we were on the same page. When one of us invoked a disciplinary concept, we were much more familiar with it than we would have been otherwise. The third question was about, was it about industry, industrial production?
Yes.
I cut it. And it was the choice between mechanization or labor. It was a technology question. Well, I don't think it's an either or, actually. As time goes on, mechanization proceeds apace. But in industrial production, there will always be waste. I don't think any industrial production can be 100% efficient in energy or in materials. So there will always be a need for waste disposal. And whether it's a machine or labor, it depends on relative costs. And I think as the municipal labor force impressed on me, they are not anti-mechanization, but there are some jobs which can't be mechanized. For that, what they need is respect and an increase in the status of that work as being essential work to the economy of the town. So I don't think it's either or. And I think the main problem is the status of that work.
Yeah, the next question is, class is a very significant aspect in the metabolic rate and the waste economy. How do you think gender figures in this analysis?
I just finished writing a paper about gender in the waste economy.
How do you bring in gender in this analysis?
Women earn less, they work longer, they work in the worst kinds of waste. They're harassed. Yes, they're subordinated through their position in the waste economy. There are a large number of women workers in the waste economy. When I spoke to C2 union leaders, women, who are illiterate but extremely well trained and knowledgeable, they simply said that don't be a woman. And the Dalit activists also said the same thing, that women's work conditions are worse than those of men. And yet this is an area where entry is very easy. Entry is easy, exit is exceedingly difficult. But it's shit work for women. Literally and figuratively.
Yeah, another question is, I think that the connection between your analysis of the waste economy and the metabolic drift. I think you have explained, but maybe briefly, if you can explain the connection between.
There's somebody called Kasturi who's unmuted, and it would help.
Yeah. Please mute.
That's right. Thank you, Kasturi. In which case I failed if I haven't explained the relationship between the metabolic rift and waste. In the quote that I read out from Marx, I thought the connection was completely clear, that whereas their model was of agricultural surpluses entering the town as raw materials for clothing and as food, the waste of the town was not returned to agriculture and flowed to the sea, down the drains and the rivers from the town. Insofar as those waste resources are not returned to agriculture, there is a metabolic rift. Now, urban economy depends on much more than agriculture, but those resources are not returned to where they originated. And so a metabolic rift is being created in non-agricultural sectors as well. And that metabolic, and those metabolic flows are waste flows. And so as social scientists, what we can do is study the composition of those waste flows. And I apologized when I introduced this idea for the fact that I'm not a physical scientist, and I don't exactly know the composition of the 200 raw materials into which the town's waste is classified for reprocessing. But half of the town's waste is reprocessed. Reprocessing takes materials and takes energy, so we can't envisage that to be a completely physically efficient process. But that's where I see, I may be wrong, but where I see waste fitting into the concept of the metabolic rift. And the metabolic rift is a useful concept because it can inspire work from physical sciences and biological sciences as well as social sciences. I hope that's clarified.
Yeah, thank you. Next question is, given the durability of the logic of capital, would it be reasonable to argue that the response to the circuit of capital has to be political, of democratic deliberation and political pressure, rather than primarily a technological fix?
I agree. And also, I suppose the balance of this talk didn't focus on caste and gender and forms of social subordination and discrimination. But because I know that waste is a sink, not just for materials, but also for social relations, which are highly oppressive, I would say it has to be a social response, a socio-political response. And I would begin at the top, not just, and I feel in policy of human development issues, often pincer movements from above and below are powerful. And just as Baswada Wilson in Delhi has a very powerful social movement of manual scavengers and waste pickers, as they call them, for a transformation of their social status and a rehabilitation of their work. I would say the same from the top, that upper caste people need to understand that they don't have a God-given right to throw waste everywhere. And that it's easy to say, but then you're immediately plunged into the architecture of high-rise flats, over waste segregation, domestic waste segregation. Who does it? Where is it to be done? How is it to be collected, both from its points of origin and from vehicles which are not designed for segregated waste? I don't underestimate the implications of what I'm saying.
Yeah, there are other big questions. So, if you have time, maybe you can continue. Very big question. It's from Zad Mahmood. You know him, right? Zad Mahmood?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's Zad's question. The metabolic rift that you mentioned, does it also resonate the rift between anthropocentric and biocentric understanding of development? Expanding your ideas, do we need to revise the curriculum of development studies as a discipline? Second, in the neoliberal framework, would a state policy to incentivize waste management through subsidies or taxation be a way to tackle the immediate ecological problem of waste? Your case suggests that neoliberalism was a cause in aggravating the waste problem rather than resolving it.
Thank you. An expression of the metabolic rift is the rift in knowledge. And I agree that there is a rift between anthropocentric understandings. There are rifts within. There are all kinds of theoretical incompatibilities between positivist kind of understanding and interpretivist understandings of our cultures. And there is a big rift, an ontological rift between understanding social environment and understanding the biophysical environment, which you can well call a rift because the two cultures have never met. And that's what Gail Umfit is calling for in her essay, in the book in which Professor Bhakti has a chapter on development alternatives. How they're to be developed is, I'm probably past making a very positive contribution to. However, there's a website for a group of university teachers called Teachers Against Climate Crisis, which has gone from 4 people to over 150 in 1 year, based in Delhi. Look at their website, because on the website, not only do they have a lot of very interesting lectures about the climate crisis from experts in nitrogen, experts from engineering and from physics, right through to historians. They also have suggestions about how curricula could be transformed. And so it's not a hopeless cause. I think it's something which is in development, and in development in India, where India is taking a lead. So I'm very much I urge you to be I encourage you to think about how curricula can be revised, not just to cope with climate change and all its many manifestations, because climate change is reductionist and the metabolic rift is an encompassing concept for all the earth processes which are being disrupted. So yes, and given we live in neoliberal states, yes, we should look like hawks at what these states are going to promise in Glasgow. Can it be done by subsidies and taxation? It ought to be able to be done by subsidies and taxation. But what I feel from having looked at waste and its non-policy is that when we think about policy, we should mainstream in our thinking and our teaching, and this applies to policymakers as well as academics, what institutions would need to be in place for this obviously good policy to work out as it's intended? What are the existence conditions for this policy? We don't normally do that, but I feel it should be integrated into policy analysis. And the second thing that needs integration is that all policies have enemies. Yes, in an apparently sensible policy, who will be the enemies and how will they be bought off or destroyed or bypassed or neutralized? And again, policy dialogue very often neglects these questions, and this is why policies often have outcomes which are not intended or expected. So if, Zard, you can do the intellectual heavy lifting and figure out what the existence conditions for your duo of taxation and subsidies would be. But one of the obvious ones that I encountered in fieldwork is that people don't pay taxes and they get away with it. Just as waste is a problem of high caste, waste is also a problem of local capitalists who don't contribute to public expenditure. And so there are these prior conditions that need to be in place, which ought to be mainstreamed as part of a responsible policy suggestion. Do you get my drift?
Yeah, yes, I do. I do. I do. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay. So there are a couple of other questions, but some of the questions are related to what you have already said. And so one question is that, basically the idea of sustainability and more, radical ecological kind of thinking. So here the question is that, sustainability, don't you think the sustainability idea is dated? And now this more radical ecological thinking is needed or something? Do you agree with that? Radical ecological possibility? I don't know what he means by this, but So.
Well, I may have an idea. I'm not quite sure either. But sustainability has become a fuzzy word, subject to multiple meanings, which we can all agree on, though we don't actually understand. So even economists think of sustainability in terms of growth, whereas an environmental scientist might have horrors at that definition of sustainability. So sustainability is all things to all people, and the Sustainable Development Goals have all kinds of contradictions, and there is a scholarly subfield that tears them apart. One reaction is exactly as the question implies, which is to jettison a concept which is being absorbed through being fuzzified, such that it doesn't have meaning. Another reaction is to define it clearly and stick to your own clearly defined definition, right? radical ecology is also quite a wide field. It's not one single approach. Running through all of this is what to do about capitalism. And we're in a very difficult position where many of us have grave doubts over whether the ecological crisis can be solved under capitalism. The metabolic rift can be restored under capitalism. But the time horizon is such that there is no alternative, although we might work to try to build it. There's no alternative with countervailing power. Hence, we may have to work within the capitalism that we know is fraught with problems. And that is a very difficult place to be in. But I think many people are actually writhing around in that space. I don't think it's something that's resolvable in the time frame that is open, apparently open, and that the IPC says we have.
So any of you, I think one person asked to question verbally. So you can unmute and ask the question if you like. Please unmute your microphone and ask. Bruce Wayne, please go ahead.
Ma'am,
Yes, ask your question.
sir, I typed my question. Agriculture market can high growth in agriculture market can fall any impact on metabolic rift and West economy. And my second question is that the new farmer bill have fall any impact on West economy?
Sorry,
New farm bill. You must have heard about this farm act.
Yes.
Yeah. So new farm bill. Is there any connection between the two, or do you think that it will change?
Sorry, what connection between the new farm bills and?
Yeah, on
what?
On what you have discussed in the context of agriculture.
So new farmer bills means that the farmers directly sell their crop to the multinationals. So it have any impact because there is no intermediary. So there is any impact on the West economy.
I'm not sure I understand the.
Yeah, I mean, it may not have, yeah.
What I understand is that the invitation to corporate capital, if it succeeds, will widen the metabolic rift in agriculture. But I don't know, and I don't think the research has been done to explain how the intermediate classes of commercial capital are reacting and resisting the invasion of their territory by corporate capital, which seems to be the underlying purpose of the farm bills. Whether they think life will be easy, whether they have diversified portfolios or they think life will be easy as an agent of a corporate instead of buying and selling themselves. I don't know. And the other doubt I have is that this corporate capital supplying supermarkets in global value chains is quite capable of marketing organic produce. In North Oxford, all of the supermarkets in which I buy food have little corners for organic produce. So organic agriculture is not incompatible with corporate agricultural markets. And that's a feature of capital. It diversifies. It's able to take over organic agriculture. I don't suppose this is a very good argument, but answer to your question. But what was the other aspect of your question?
Okay, it's okay. So we have, I think you have answered most of the questions, and so thank you very much, and thank you giving us so much time. Oh. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir. Okay. So, Barbara, so let me thank you again. And so it was really a wonderful experience for all of us, and the talk and questions and answers. And so thank you very much. And we hope that we'll meet again sometime. And when things get normal, and then we visit Kolkata and we'll see you again. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I would love to visit Kolkata. Thank you, Professor Bagchi and Professor Chakravarti, everybody who's stayed the course and listened to this. It's been a real privilege as well as a pleasure. Go well. Stay
Thank you.
safe.
Thank you. And thank you, and bye to all. Thank you for participating. Thank you very much. So we close the session.